Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be reading Defeating Darwinism by Opening Minds by Philip E. Johnson, Chapter 5, Intelligent Design. George C. Williams is not as well known to the public as Richard Dawkins or Stephen Jay Gould, but he is one of the world's most respected and influential evolutionary biologists. He is best known for pioneering the gene selection version of Darwinism, which is popularized by Dawkins in The Selfish Gene. Very briefly, gene selectionism says that natural selection selects genes, not whole organisms. However fit a plant or animal may be, in the end it dies and returns to the dust of the earth. What remains are its genes, encoded in DNA, because the genes are passed on to the next generation in the process of reproduction. This means that genes, rather than bodies or minds, are the central actors in the evolutionary drama. The story of life then goes something like this. The story of life, starring Gene. In the beginning, there was a naked gene that somehow evolved from a chemical soup. This gene had two important properties. It could reproduce by copying itself, and it could engage in some sort of chemical activity analogous to eating. Mistakes were made in the copying process, and so the descendants of the first gene had varying capabilities. Those that were better at eating, and especially reproducing, left more offspring than their less proficient sisters and cousins, and so the Darwinian process of natural selection could begin. Eventually, some genes learned to make bodies in a process that we now call embryonic development. As applied to humans, that's the development of the baby in the mother's womb. Those genes that could make bodies had a competitive advantage in the struggle for survival, all the more so as their body-building capabilities improved. A slogan humorously captures the basic idea. A chicken is just an egg's way of making another egg. Gene selectionists talk and write as if genes can think and plan strategies for survival. They do not mean this literally, of course, but as a metaphor for a process that is directed only by the blind force of natural selection. In brief, the gene selection theory posits that the particular types of genes improve their own chances for survival by making, or improving, organisms that are themselves good at surviving and reproducing. Natural selection thus ensures that the world would be dominated by those types of genes that happen to be good at making plants and animals that are good at passing their own genes on to descendants. Gene selectionism is an example of what philosophers call reductionism. Reductionists claim that everything, including our minds, can be reduced to its material base. For example, Dawkins has written that the discovery of the structure of DNA as genetic code has dealt the final killing blow to the belief that living material is deeply distinct from non-living material. Life is matter and only matter. Dawkins does not flinch from applying this philosophy to human beings. We are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules of DNA known as genes. The only purpose of life is DNA survival. A person is nothing more than a DNA's way of making more DNA like itself. That's materialistic reductionism as articulated by Richard Dawkins, today's most influential evolutionary biologist. Information and the word. Although George C. Williams did more than anyone to develop the gene selection theory, he seems to be having second thoughts about the underlying reductionism. In a 1994 book, supplemented here by an interview published in 1995, he endorsed a very different idea that life contains a distinct non-material component called information. Because the subject is so important and controversial, I'd better quote his exact words. Evolutionary biologists have failed to realize that they work with two or more less incommensurable domains, that of information and that of matter. Those two domains can never be brought together in any kind of sense, usually implied by the term reductionism. The gene is a package of information, not an object. The pattern of those base pairs in a DNA molecule specifies the gene, but the DNA molecule is the medium, it's not the message. Maintaining this distinction between the medium and the message is absolutely indispensable to clarity of thought about evolution. Just the fact that 15 years ago I started using a computer may have had something to do with my ideas here. The constant process of transferring information from one physical medium to another and then being able to recover the same information to the original medium brings home the severability of information and matter. In biology, when you're talking about things like genes and genotypes and gene pools, you're talking about the information, not physical objective reality. Williams uses the novel Don Quixote, I have no idea how to pronounce it, as its example for the matter-information duality. A computer operating system like Windows 95 would provide a similar example. A book or a computer program contains complex information recorded in matter, whether the matter be ink and paper or on a silicon disk. Information can be switched from one medium to another or even stored in the human brain. The content of the book or the computer program is not specified by the physical or chemical laws governing the medium. If it were, all books would be alike, or perhaps would differ according to the qualities of ink and paper used to write them. In fact, the content of the message is independent of the physical makeup of the medium. Don Quixote loses nothing of its meaning or literary quality if it is not printed on the cheapest paper. And a trashy romance novel does not improve in quality if it is printed on expensive silk. The medium and the message are two entirely different kinds of things. As William explains, you can speak of galaxies and particles of dust in the same terms, because they both have mass and charge and length and width. You can't do that with information and matter. Information doesn't have mass or charge or length in millimeters. Likewise, matter doesn't have bytes. This dearth of shared descriptors makes matter and information two separate domains of existence which have to be discussed separately in their own terms. That way of describing reality brings to mind the biblical description of how the world began. The Gospel of John begins with a memorable statement that, "In the beginning was the Word." That is exactly how we should describe the creation of a literary work or computer program or a building. In the beginning was the concept and the working out of that concept in the mind of the author or designer. Thereafter, the concept was recorded or realized in matter. Matter is important but secondary. The word information is not reducible to matter, even precedes matter. If only matter existed in the beginning and the first verse of the Gospel of John, and the worldview of the Bible is false. In the beginning were the particles, and everything else came only from them. A reductionist understanding of the universe leaves no room for God, much less for the Word of God. If everything came from matter, then the information in the local living organisms is located in genes made of DNA. Then it seems logical to suppose that DNA and life are virtually the same thing. Williams singled out Dawkins for criticism on this point, as one who defines a replicator in a way that makes it a physical entity duplicating itself in a reproductive process, adding that Dawkins was misled by the fact that genes are always identified with DNA. If Dawkins had been misled, however, it is not for some trivial reason. It is because highly complex information that is independent of matter implies an intelligent source that produced for the information, and the main point of Darwinism for Dawkins is to eliminate that possibility from consideration. To see why this is so, consider the crucial role of an author in producing the information in a book. Williams uses himself this analogy, and anyone who uses a word processor can see at once what he means. A book isn't just ink and paper. This book you are reading, like any other, contains information written on paper with ink. The information did not always take that physical form, however. Originally, I wrote it on a word processor and existed only as an electronic file on a computer disk. I sent some completed chapters by email to friends and colleagues for criticism. The information in each chapter was exactly the same whether it was recorded on paper or on a computer disk or in some fragmented and disembodied form as it moved over the links of the internet. Information is also stored by some poorly understood means in our brains. If all the copies of Shakespeare's plays were destroyed, nothing would be permanently lost. Actors who had learned the rules could easily recreate the text from memory. Such examples tell us that information is entirely different kind of stuff from the physical medium in which it may temporarily be recorded. It would be absurd to try to explain the literary quality or meaning of a book as an emergent property of the physical qualities of its ink and paper. A message comes from an author, ink, and paper are merely the media. Similarly, the information written in DNA is not the product of DNA. Where did the information come from? Who or what is the author? Physical laws cannot be the answer to that question. These laws do produce some fairly complex structures, such as snowflakes and crystals. In some cases, the laws reproduce the same structure over and over again with chance variations. Repetitive order has a very low information content. Same laws that form the crystals prevent any more complex ordering from emerging, because they ensure that the same pattern will always be repeated according to the formula. Similarly, we might create a sort of book by programming a computer with a formula like this one. Keep repeating the word stuff until the printer runs out of paper. A book written that way would be very boring to read, and it would never get more interesting even if we kept on printing forever. The only variety would come from an occasional typographical error. Otherwise, it would just be more stuff all the way to eternity. If physical laws cannot provide the information in a book, what could random chance do the job? I wouldn't bore you with the math, but just about everybody, including Richard Dawkins, agrees that it is essentially impossible to produce a coherent book of average length by randomly combining letters, spaces, and punctuation marks. Even a single sentence like "in the beginning was a word" is extremely unlikely to come from pouring out a random mix of letters and spaces. As I said, that is undisputed. Some do say, however, that chance can do the job if it is combined with some principle of selection. Bear's blunder again. Many people with underpowered baloney detectors have misled on this critical point by a common Darwinian application of Bear's blunder. It actually is possible to produce a written text by supplying random letters, if some selector, like a computer program, preserves every letter that happens to end up in the right place. Thus we can get "in the beginning was the word." if the program supplies random letters until an I happens to appear in the first space or a D in the final space, and so on. Whenever a letter appears in the correct slot, the program preserves it there, like the uncovered letter on the TV program Wheel of Fortune. Very soon the spaces will all be filled with the correct letters and we will have the whole sentence. The whole thing seems absurdly easy, so easy that you ought to smell a rat. With fast enough computer generating thousands of random letters a second, we can reproduce the whole Bible in a matter of hours, plus the Chicago telephone directory as a bonus. All we have to do is write the Bible and whatever else we want into the computer's memory first, and have the computer preserve the desired letters in the right places until all the spaces are filled. Richard Dawkins actually uses examples like this to illustrate the creative power of natural selection, and his readers apparently don't see that it's just a trick. If a computer selection program can duplicate a library that easily, can't natural selection make an organism? You probably have spotted the trick already, but I'll explain it to you just to make sure. Computer selection, like automobile design, illustrates intelligent planning, authorship, not chance or survival of the fittest. It is just as if an author were trying to write the target phrase, except that the author is to wait a bit for the right letters to appear in the right spaces. The first letters to appear are meaningless, and the computer knows which ones to select only because it has the target text in its memory. Natural selection, on the other hand, is supposed to be mindless and hence incapable of pursuing a distinct goal. If natural selection could preserve a presently meaningless mutation because it might become useful later on when other new mutations occur, this would imply that evolution is a purposeful process, supervised by a pre-existing mind. As we have seen, supervised evolution is a gradual version of creationism. As materialists use the term, it is not evolution at all. Let's review what we know. So far, we have the following basic points. First, life consists not of just matter, chemicals, but of matter and information. Second, information is not reducible to matter, but is a different kind of stuff altogether. A theory of life thus has to explain not just the origin of the matter, but also the independent origin of the information. Third, complex. Specified information of the kind found in a book or biological cell cannot be produced either by chance or at the direction of physical and chemical laws. Attempts to prove that it can typically employ variations of Barrett's blunder. With those general principles in mind, now let's go to the biology. Are organisms designed, or are they the products of unintelligent natural causes? Opening the black boxes of biology. To answer that question, we have to look beneath the surface of life to the biochemistry underneath. The biologists of the 19th and early 20th centuries who established Darwinism and materialism as a scientific orthodoxy knew little of biochemistry, and imagined the cell to be something rather simple that could just ooze itself out of some chemical broth. The term black box grew out of the efforts of scientists to expose medical hoaxes. A quack doctor might offer to cure whatever ails you by hooking you up to a mysterious black machine with all sorts of dials and switches on the cover, but nothing inside. More generally, any machine that does wonderful things by a mechanism nobody knows is called a black box. The computers on which we write are black boxes to most authors because we have only the vaguest idea of how they work. Without a knowledge of molecular biology, bodily functions like vision and blood clotting are black boxes. We know that they work wonders, but we don't know how they work. Without a detailed knowledge, a biologist's notion of how, say, vision might evolve is as valueless as my speculations on how to build a computer. In his book, Darwin's Black Box, molecular biologist Michael Behe explains that scientists have begun to open the black boxes of biology, and they have revealed a fantastically complex world of interacting proteins and enzymes underneath. Here, just to give a sample, is Behe's description of the part of molecular mechanism for vision. When light first strikes the retina, a photon interacts with a molecule called 11-cis retinol, which rearranges within picoseconds to transretinal. A picosecond is about the time it takes light to travel the breadth of a single human hair. The change in shape of the retinal molecule forces a change in the shape of the protein rostedin, to which the retinol is tightly bound. The protein's metamorphosis alters its behavior. Now called metarhodocin II, the protein sticks to another protein called transducin. Before bumping into metarhodocin II, transducin is tightly bound to a small molecule called GDP. When the transducin interacts with the metamorphosin II, the GDP falls off, and a molecule called GTP binds to the transducin. GDP is closely related to, but critically different from, GDP. There is a lot more like that, but don't worry, I'm not going to inflict it on you. If you're interested in molecular biology, go read his book. If not, all you need to understand is that molecular mechanisms are incredibly complex. This means that it is simply that they are made of many parts that interact in complex ways, and all the parts need to work together. Any single part has no useful function unless all the other parts are also present. There is therefore no pathway of functional intermediate stages by which a Darwinian process could build such a system step by tiny step. Molecular mechanisms, Behe says, are as obviously designed as a spaceship or a computer. You can't explain the origin of any biological capability, like vision, unless you can explain the origin of the molecular mechanisms that make it work. Evolutionary biologists have been able to pretend to know how complex biological systems originated only because they treated them as black boxes. Now that biochemists have opened the black boxes and seen what is inside, they know the Darwinian theory is just a story, not a scientific explanation. The attempt to climb Mount Improbable. Behe published his book in 1996, the same year in which Richard Dawkins published Climbing Mount Improbable. The Mountain of Dawkins title is Biological Complexity, because Dawkins cheerfully acknowledges that plants and animals really are extremely complicated and that the analogy we have made to books and computers is valid. In his vivid words, physics books may be complicated, but the origins and phenomena that a physics book describes are simpler than a single cell in the body of its author. The author consists of trillions of those cells, many of them different from each other, organized with intricate architecture and precision engineering into a working machine capable of writing a book. Each nucleus contains a digitally coded database larger in information content than all 30 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica put together. And this figure is for each cell, not all the cells of the body put together. Dawkins rules out the possibility that such a database could be created all at once. To do that would require a prestigious mind and hence would amount to supernatural creation. Just as a mountain climber has to go up the mountain step by step, biological evolution has to go through a series of intermediate functional steps in order to create each biological system, including the mind and body of the author of that physics book. Each step represents a random mutation, usually defined as copying error in the reproduction of DNA. This means that the steps must be very small indeed, because mutations that are large enough to have visible effects on the organism are nearly always harmful or even fatal. We may not see the intermediate steps today, but every Darwinist must believe that they once existed as actual living organisms. If such a thing as truly irreducible complexity actually exists, Dawkins concedes that the functional intermediate steps could not have existed in Darwinism is not true. Who's right, Dawkins or Behe? Is the argument about science or about philosophy? Behe says, and I agree, that the dispute is mainly philosophical. Science, he writes, is published in professional, peer-reviewed scientific journals. Behe's search of the professional journals reveals the absence of any serious efforts to lay out plausible, testable scenarios for the step-by-step evolution of molecular mechanisms. Such half-hearted attempts as exist are full of what scientists call hand-waving. New molecular steps mysteriously stand forth or emerge or just appear without any realistic mechanism. Molecular biologists don't even attempt to fill in the Darwinian theory with specific examples because they don't know how to do it. The textbooks typically endorse Darwinism and in general terms in the introductory chapter and thereafter ignore it. Most molecular biologists accept Darwinism uncritically because they are scientific materialists and have no alternative, but the Darwinian mechanism plays no role in their science. Science or philosophy? Most readers of this book probably don't feel qualified to judge scientific disputes. For that matter, Richard Dawkins himself is a zoologist and not a biochemist. He told me himself that he doesn't feel qualified to debate Behe's scientific claims. What you and I and Dawkins can judge is whether Behe is right about the state of knowledge among molecular biologists as reflected in the scientific literature. As scientists learn about the complexity of molecular mechanisms, do they find it possible to explain their origin by specific evolutionary pathways through functional intermediate stages? Or do they continue to believe in the existence of those pathways merely because their materialist philosophy allows no alternative? An answer to that question may be found in the initial reaction of prominent scientists in Behe's book. Molecular biologist James Sharperio of the University of Chicago agreed with Behe that the Darwinian theory cannot explain molecular complexity. He wrote in National Review, "There are no detailed Darwinian accounts for the evolution of any fundamental biochemical cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculations. It is remarkable that Darwinism is accepted as a satisfactory explanation for such a vast subject. Evolution with so little rigorous examination of how well its basic theses work in illuminating specific instances of biological adaptation or diversity." That sounds like a ringing endorsement of Behe's scientific claims, but Sharperio nonetheless blasted Behe for arguing that those unexpected biochemical systems might be designed. Raising the possibility was fighting the battles of the past rather than seeing the vision of the future. That's another illustration of how strong the hold of materialist philosophy is on the minds of contemporary biologists. If Behe's science is accurate, why should the vision of the future exclude design? Champollion then proceeded from philosophical prejudice to form um, a, mm, to a form of confusion we have seen before. What Behe failed to recognize, he wrote, was that we now have experience with computers. Having exemplars of physical objects endowed with computational and decision-making capabilities show that there is nothing mystical, religious, or supernatural about discussing the potential for similarly intelligent action by living organisms. In a sense, that's perfectly correct. It's also another instance of Barrett's blunder. Those computers are intelligently designed. Unassisted matter never made a computer, nor did naturalistic evolution. Although James Champollion was confused about the concept of design, he did take the high road by considering Behe's argument fairly. Another prominent University of Chicago biologist, Jerry Cohn, writing in the prestigious British journal Nature, took the low road of appealing to prejudice. Cohn began and ended his review with attacks on biblical fundamentalists, trying mightily to leave the impression that what is at issue is preserving the independence of science from religious control. Behe is a Roman Catholic who has no religious objection to Darwinian evolution. His argument is simply that the Darwinian mechanism has no scientific merit in molecular biology. Neither Champollion or Cohn contradicted Behe on any specific point. The objections were entirely philosophical, based on a failure to comprehend the concept of design. These reactions illustrate the thinking problems that I described in the preceding chapter. There are two definitions of science at work in the scientific culture, and a concealed contradiction between them is beginning to come out into public view. On the one hand, science is dedicated to empirical evidence and to following that evidence wherever it leads. That is why science has to be free from the Bible, because the Bible was seen to constrain the possibilities science were allowed to consider. On the other hand, science also means applied materialistic philosophy. Scientists are materialists who always look for strictly materialist explanations of every phenomenon, and they want to believe that such explanations always exist. This raises a question: what will the scientists do if the evidence starts to point away from materialism and toward the possibility that a creator is necessary at all? Will they follow the possibility that will they follow the evidence wherever it leads, or will they ignore the evidence because their philosophy does not allow it to exist? Most scientists won't discuss that possibility openly. One who has enough self-confidence to do it is the famous Harvard geneticist Marxist Richard Lewitton, one of the most influential biologists in the world. Lewitton has written, "It is not the methods and the institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and set of concepts to produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." The eminent Kant scholar Louis Beck used to say that anyone who could believe in God could also believe in anything. To appeal an omnipotent deity is to allow that any moment the regularities of nature may be ruptured, that miracles may happen. In other words, evolution is not a fact, it's a philosophy. The materialism comes first, a priori, and evidence is interpreted in light that the unchangeable philosophical commitment. If the evidence seems to go against the philosophy, so much the worse for the evidence. To materialists, putting up with any amount of bad practice in science is better than to let the divine foot in the door. The contradiction between materialism and reality arises frequently in biology, but is not the most inescapable when we consider the human mind. Are our thoughts nothing but the products of chemical reactions in the brain, and did our thinking abilities originate for no reason other than their utility in allowing our DNA to reproduce itself? Even scientific materialists have a hard time believing that. For one thing, materialism applied to the mind undermines the validity of all reasoning, including one's own. If our theories are the products of chemical reactions, how can we know whether our theories are true? Perhaps Richard Dawkins believes in Darwinism only because he has a certain chemical in his brain, and his belief could be changed by somehow inserting a different chemical. The absurdity to which this kind of reductionist thinking leads is marvelously illustrated by a story told by John Hargan, a writer for Scientific American. As at a scientific conference, philosopher David Chalmers argued that a materialist science cannot explain the human consciousness. His arguments were persuasive, and the scientists treated them respectfully, but they all wondered, what follows? If science cannot explain the mind, then what explanation could there possibly be? Hargan explains, Chalmers thought he had found a possible solution. Scientists should assume that information is as essential a property as reality as matter and energy. As we saw earlier in this chapter, that is exactly what George C. Williams was led to believe in spite of his materialistic philosophy. Horgan comments that Chalmers' matter-information dualism cannot be true because science tells us that only the particles make up the matter and energy were present at the beginning. That's an illustration of the fallacy begging a question, because the assumption of the matter necessarily comes before mind is what Chalmers was denying. Nevertheless, Horgan reports, Chalmers' ideas struck a chord among his audience. They thronged around him after his speech, telling him how much they had enjoyed his message. One listener was displeased, however. This was Christoph Koch, a dedicated materialist who collaborated with Francis Crick on the brain research. Horgan went on to tell how materialistic dealt with the mystic. That night, Koch tracked Chalmers down at a cocktail party for the conferences and chased at him for his speech. It is precisely because philosophical approaches to consciousness have all failed that scientists must focus on the brain, Koch declared in his rapid-fire German accented voice, as rubberneckers gathered. Chalmers' information-based theory of consciousness, Koch continued, like all philosophical ideas, was untestable and therefore useless. Why don't you just say that when you have a brain, the Holy Ghost comes down and makes you conscious? Koch exclaimed. Such a theory was unnecessarily complicated, Chalmers responded dryly, and it would not accord with his own subjective experience. But how do I know that your subjective experience is the same as mine? Koch sputtered. How do I even know you're conscious? Koch went on to admit to Horgan that he had actually agreed with Chalmers that science cannot solve the consciousness problem. What this means to him is that consciousness must be meaningless or illusory. How do I even know you're conscious? He repeated to Horgan. Indeed, for that matter, maybe Koch himself is permanently asleep and is just dreaming that he is conscious. Perhaps his thoughts are just illusions that his DNA has programmed into his brain to encourage him to make more DNA. A true believing materialist will embrace even madness if the only alternative is to give up materialism. So far, we have seen that there is an ample reason to believe that Darwinism is sustained not by an impartial interpretation of the evidence, but by dogmatic adherence to philosophy even in the teeth of this evidence. But can anything be done about the situation? The scientific establishment has immense power, particularly when it is supported by the media and the government. Critics can't get a fair hearing as long as the microphone man filters everything they say through the inherently wooden stereotype. We need to think about strategy, and that's our next subject.